Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the country. This is the Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program Ethics and Advocacy and Program Management webinar designed for new.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, welcome. This is the Ombudsman Program Ethics and Advocacy and Program Management webinar designed for new state ombudsmen. We're glad to have you all with us. Today is Wednesday, August the 23rd, and we're going to delve into the topic of ethics. I'd like to, at this point, ask everyone, Katie, if you could unmute everyone. I'd like to have everybody introduce themselves, your name, the state, and the years or months that you've been the state ombudsman. So
everyone should be unmuted now.
Somebody just start off.
This is Joe Rodriguez. This month it's 15 years.
From California.
Yes.
Sean Lonigan from Vermont, and since May of 2017.
This is Carla Backman, North Dakota, 3 years next month.
Other people were introducing your name, the state, and the years and months that you've been the state ombudsman. Okay, it looks like we've got some.
This is Bev Laubert. You'll hear from me later, but I'm from Ohio and 23 years.
Anybody else want to introduce yourself? You should be unmuted. Okay, well, thank you. And Katie, if you'll mute the other people besides the panelists, that would be great. So what we're going to be doing for the next come up, the types of issues and questions that might come up, and just look at some basics for things that you need to be doing and that you need to be ensuring that your representatives are doing. We're hoping that this information is presented in such a way that you can turn around and use this material for your own use in your own state, add it to what has already been developed, or use it as a building block in which to be able to make sure that all representatives of the program understand the consequences of being ethical, and then the consequences of what happens when you're not following this basic tenet of being an ombudsman for residents of long-term care facilities. We're so glad today to have two great speakers to talk about this issue. You've just heard from Bev Laubert. She is the Ohio State Long-Term Care Ombudsman, and as she said, she's been there for 23 years. One of the handouts that we sent out to you earlier and is also in the toolbox on the right-hand side of your GoToMeeting page is an article or a chapter that she and her husband Michael wrote regarding ethics, law, and aging, and it's about 12 pages, and it is well worth taking 20 minutes to read that article. It just really does a good job of explaining the Ombudsman program and how ethics fit into the work that we do. So Bev, thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of today's presentation. And our other speaker is Sarah Hunt, which many of you know. Sarah has been a state ombudsman. She has been a consultant to NICNR and Consumer Voice, and she has been a consultant for the National Ombudsman Resource Center for years and years, pretty much since the Resource Center began. And she is the author of many of the training modules and other resources that ombudsmen use across the country. So thank you, Sarah, for being with us today. And at this point, I'm just going to turn it over to Sarah to begin the conversation. Sarah?
Thank you, Carol. I always enjoy talking about ethics. And today, as Carol mentioned, we are really focusing in on some applications for program management. So first of all, to kind of lay the foundation, it's what is ethics? Well, basically, the dictionary talks about it as being a set of moral principles. So you have a theory or system of moral values, the principles of conduct governing an individual or a group, and a guiding philosophy. Like many other professions, the ombudsmen have a code of ethics that provides the guiding philosophy and principles for their work. Long years ago, a number of people who became state ombudsmen said, well, what's the code of ethics? And at that point in time, there wasn't one. So the National Association of State Long-Term Care Ombudsman Programs developed one over a period of quite a few months and maybe years, tweaking it. And more recently, the National Association of Local Long-Term Care Ombudsmen developed one for them, for people working at the ombudsman representative level, but the two are very consistent with each other. And bottom line is, ombudsman responsibilities go from individual advocacy to systems change, and sometimes it's really difficult to know what your real due north is, what's your compass, and the Code of Ethics does that, and it helps make sure that ombudsmen always exemplify ethical behavior and decision making. So the first poll question is, do you have a professional code of ethics associated with a degree or credential other than the Ombudsman Code of Ethics? For example, if you are a nurse, if you're a social worker, if you are any one of a number of other professions, you may have your own code of ethics in addition to the code of ethics for ombudsmen. So just weigh in with your response. And Katie, when it looks like most people have responded, just show us the results, please.
%78% of people said yes, and 22% said no.
Great, thank you. Sometimes, and one reason I ask that is a number of people come to the role of the state ombudsman and they look at the Ombudsman Code of Ethics, and then they look at what they have from another professional credential, and they look at any kind of consistency or disconnects between the two, and sometimes questions arise. So the Code of Ethics for Ombudsman, one thing to remember is that ombudsman work is just filled with ambiguity. So if people want definite boxes and black and white answers all the time, or they become really anxious, probably becoming a long-term care ombudsman is not the best fit for a line of work for them. Because ombudsmen often are working with individuals who have cognitive impairments, or you wade through the midst of situations where there are a number of different conflicting views as well as values, and a number of times there are a lot of questions about circumstances. And to amplify that a little bit more, in terms of client-resident characteristics, I talked about some individuals have cognitive impairments. They're very frail. They have conditions that may change very quickly, and they move from one setting to another. Sometimes ombudsmen may encounter situations where what the resident wants may seem unwise or offensive or ill-conceived, even to the ombudsman. And those situations sometimes raise red flags, but sometimes not until it's kind of late and an ombudsman has taken a step that in retrospect maybe wasn't the best one to take. And then also ombudsmen deal with communities of individuals, sometimes with conflicting values and desires and needs. One thing to remember is there usually aren't right or wrong actions. There's some that are better than others, and there are some situations, obviously, where there are definitely wrong actions. But for the most part, it's not really clear-cut where you need to be going or how to resolve a case until you really gain a lot more information. And we'll be talking about that briefly soon. But sometimes what the resident wants differs from what staff, the family want, or what maybe even medical professionals who are not part of the staff want. And then the resident's perspective sometimes changes as you begin to work with them and talk with them, and they talk with other people. So achieving consistency in ombudsman approaches, especially in these tough situations, is an ongoing challenge. And I think that's where the Code of Ethics really helps guide actions, as well as anything that you have in your policies and procedures. Often the dilemmas may arise around how do you apply the specific ethical principles to different kinds of scenarios. And you want to make sure as a program manager that people turn to you at the right times so that you can provide guidance, even in applying your own policies and procedures to their work when they hit these sticky situations. So we have another poll question. Is training on the Code of Ethics for Ombudsman part of the initial or ongoing training in your statewide ombudsman program? Yes or no? And Katie, when it looks like we have a fair number of people responding, just let us know the results, please, and close the poll.
Okay, 80% of people said yes and 20% said no.
Thank you. The ethical principles and Code of Ethics are integrated throughout the Ombudsman, the National Ombudsman Resource Center curriculum. So you don't have very many standalone units just on teaching ethics, but how you approach things from an ethical perspective and looking back at the Code of Ethics for Ombudsman is sprinkled throughout that curriculum. I wanted to point out a few pieces that we've gained from different presenters who were ethicists and philosophers and have talked to state ombudsmen over the years about how do you really do ethics. And Jackie Glover made a presentation to state and regional ombudsmen and basically gave us some good guidelines. One of which is ethics is all about the process as well as what you do. It's the how you get there that is really important. So it's not just always getting to the end result, but how do you get there? How do you think it through? What are your guiding principles? So for ombudsmen, always being sure that you empower residents and you act on behalf of residents with resident direction is essential, and the ombudsman process needs to reflect that. And in fact, the recent ombudsman rule, the section on complaint processing, gave a lot of specific guidance to ombudsmen around what it means to be resident directed and what happens when residents may not be able to express a choice on their own or clearly articulate a choice, and how do you wade through those scenarios. So there's more guidance now nationally and on a consistent basis than we've had at any point in time before then. And basically, another point that Jackie kept driving home is that good ethics begins with good facts. Well, for an ombudsman to deal with a case, an ombudsman has to do a thorough investigation. And a key part of that is the good fact finding. What do you know? How do you know it? What's factual? What's subjective? What does someone want? And it's important that ombudsmen stop and take the time to really ask the right questions, gather information, and then kind of sort it out and figure out what's real, and then talk about the best course of action to get there. I think sometimes ombudsmen are really quick to rush in, try to fix something, and maybe have missed something. But slowing it down and gaining good facts, who wants something and why, and what does that mean, and are there other alternatives, is key to acting in an ethical way as well as good ombudsman practice. And then there's always a range of morally acceptable actions. That's hard to remember sometimes because you have so many pressures with different people wanting a certain outcome, or it may be really tough to decide what people really want to untangle that. But it's important that ombudsmen realize that they need to pause and get input from a number of people and perspectives and distill it and make sure that they are acting on behalf of the resident and through resident direction. And then try to see what are the key ways of getting there and lay those out for a resident or the family member to try to deal with. It's not just one way or no way. Principles for decision making. You all are familiar with these: informed consent and autonomy, which of course is the best of all possible worlds, but many times is not the reality for ombudsman situations. Substituted judgment and best interest. And sometimes there are cases where an ombudsman uses a combination of substituted judgment. Who knows what the resident would really like? What do you think based on your long-standing relationship with them? What do you think they would choose? And then trying to factor it into some best interest decision-making and criterion. In terms of program management, I think one way to think about this is, how does your program teach these principles, these 3 different decision-making principles? And do you teach them in application to certain scenarios so that ombudsmen really understand how to apply them in different situations? And then, of course, the Ombudsman Rule speaks to a little bit of this. And how do you help your ombudsman representatives understand that a large part of what their role is with ethical issues is making sure that they create a conversation and get the right individuals engaged in dialogue and decision making when that's necessary? And then another key component, of course, is what kind of guidance do you provide and backup support and cautions to ombudsman representatives when they're dealing with a situation where a resident cannot express a decision and there's no one else to act on behalf of the resident? So not only how do your policies and procedures address that, and is it consistent with the rule, but how do you teach that so it becomes a way of thinking as a matter of course, and people don't have to stop and say, I don't know. Well, I've got to go back and do a lot of reading. They know what to do because they've had a lot of practice scenarios. Here are the key elements of substituted decision-making and judgment. Tips for practice. Conflicts usually arise over the application of values instead of over values themselves. That means, yes, who wouldn't want to exercise their own decision-making? Who wouldn't want to be able to exercise individual choice? But where the rub comes is when the choice I want to make is not what my family member thinks I should choose, or not what is convenient for caregivers or the staff or the institution itself. One caution that Joan Gibson, who is a philosopher, really urged ombudsman is in embracing resident empowerment and autonomy. Don't use that as a club so that you are dividing the resident from family members and significant others. That's the values emerge from relationships. In some cultures and with some individuals, it's important to them in their decision making that other key people sit down and help them make that decision, which doesn't mean they are not exercising individual choice. It's just how they deal with making choices. Of course, it's tricky trying to tangle that out, untangle that, pull it apart from abuse and wielding unnecessary and extreme influence over somebody. And then also values may change over time, and always realize that. Just because a person told you something one day doesn't mean the next time you deal with them, they're going to have the same value. Ombudsman Action, and I need to move along quickly. In terms of the role of the Ombudsman, it's important that Ombudsman make sure they identify the key individuals to be involved in a conversation with the resident when conflicts arise. Who can shed light, who can give information, who may offer other options, who may help ask key questions. And then the life of the Ombudsman is to be able to tolerate ambiguity. And sometimes I think even Ombudsmen want to rush in and force a solution. But the key is making sure that it doesn't happen so fast that you run over somebody's chance to be thoughtful, reflective, and to have the right people involved in making that decision, and that it's the resident's decision, not the Ombudsman's decision. So there again, the key is the process that's used, as well as the options, and then ultimately arriving at a choice. Okay, poll question 3. Is there program guidance in your program to promote consistent approaches in the gray areas, the areas of ambiguity among all Ombudsman representatives? So do you have some guidance that helps people wade through those tough situations where it's not clear cut and all yes or all no? So Katie, when it looks like most people have responded, just close the poll and share the results, please.
Okay, we're at about 80% right now. Give it another minute. Okay, 67% said yes, and 33% said no.
Okay, thank you. And from a practical perspective, it's not possible to have program guidance, policies on every single possible gray area. And if you did, it would be so many pages, nobody would read it or remember it. But I think for some of the key areas, if you could think about developing some guiding principles or ticklers for people, it might be helpful. And then in training, come up with ways to hit different types of gray areas periodically so that people learn a way of thinking and approaching something to help it be more consistent. And the more consistency you build and the more you reinforce it, the easier it is, I think, for ombudsmen and ombudsman representatives to sleep at night feeling like they did everything they could, or they took the right approach, they remained consistent in the ombudsman advocate role, because it's been something that's been ingrained, or their decision-making process and wading through the gray areas has been supported by the training, the policies and procedures, and the conversations with others in the program. Joan Gibson also gave us a few key questions that I just like to go back to, because I think they really kind of form a safety net to make sure that you've thought through issues, you've hit the key core things that need to be discussed and brought forward when it's a really messy, icky situation and it's not clear cut. And I wanted to put these up there. They're in some of the printed materials as well. But I think these also will help as a safety check that the Ombudsman's process of getting to an ethical outcome is true and consistent. And lastly, I just wanted to say that in teaching ethics, it's important to help ombudsmen be grounded in ethical principles, that's the Code of Ethics, be sensitive to ethical issues, so when they stumble across one, immediately they have little alerts going on saying, I need to think this through in a different level or different way, because there are other kinds of concerns here other than just yes or no, or regs applied or not applied. And then being able to identify the questions. If they start having some internal angst about a right course of action, to be able to think, okay, what am I feeling? What's the conflict and why? Whose interest am I really representing? What if the resident cannot express their wishes? And then provide some guidance and support, as well as training and dialogue. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bev Lauer.
Hi, everybody. So I'm charged with spending the next few minutes just talking about how we operate in Ohio and how we've applied many of the things that Sarah has spoken about. So we do use the Code of Ethics pretty heavily in our ombudsman training. We have, for our paid ombudsman staff, we have initial training of about 120 hours that lasts over 6 to 7 months. And during that training, we have lots of opportunities to listen to our new ombudsmen as they're getting practice in the field and coming back to our in-class sessions and talking about their experiences. So it gives us an opportunity to listen to them and provide feedback. On the first day of training, we, in the morning, show them a documentary called Maggie Growls. If you haven't seen it, I highly encourage you to get it and use it in your training too, because it really grounds people in advocacy and what our role is in advocacy, Maggie being the founder of the Gray Panthers. And there's even a cameo in there of Elma Holder and other friends of ours. So it's a great documentary. So we do that on the first day, and then in the morning, and then around noon, all of our state staff appear at the training to introduce themselves and so before they come to the session, our education coordinator gives them all the NASOP developed Ombudsman Code of Ethics. And so during this noon intro session with the state office staff, we talk about the Code of Ethics. It's just an opportunity for us to all sort of sit down together. We all introduce ourselves, and then we ask them, are there questions that you have about the Code of Ethics that you saw? If they don't, we're always prepared with examples of how the Code of Ethics how we've needed to pull it out in our ombudsman practice over the years, and how it's been helpful in being really a guidepost for us in some of our difficult situations, which I'll give you some examples of here shortly. So we also use the chapter that Mike and I wrote. We use that in our training as well, and we have questions. So we give them the article and then some questions that they have to do for homework, and then we have a discussion. We have a session using Sarah's materials on substituted judgment and best interest and autonomy. So that's also a separate session that we do. So again, you can see we're using Code of Ethics and ethical principles in decision making throughout our training, and then it pops up also in our case studies throughout training, and so we just think it's a really important thing. And then from a management standpoint, back around 2013, I think it was, we had an ombudsman who was who was responsible for spending a lot of time at an assisted living facility that was threatened with license revocation. And it was getting really close to license revocation date, and the home hadn't corrected, and there weren't other assisted livings in the area. So there was an interest in trying to salvage this place, so residents didn't have to move far and wide. So we asked this ombudsman to spend time at the facility at least weekly, talking with the residents, giving the resident feedback to the administrator, serving as a conduit of communication, giving the administrator ideas about what needed to be changed. And during one of these visits, he was out there and talking to residents about the possibility that they might have to move, but that we were continuing to try to get the facility to make corrections so they wouldn't have to. Always focused on being an advocate for the residents, right? So one particular day, he went out and made his visit and then went back to the office and told his supervisor, I will be leaving in a couple of weeks because I've just accepted a position as the new executive director of the facility. Well, that evening, the program director called me and told me about that. And I said, absolutely not. He doesn't get 2 weeks. You need to terminate him now, accept his resignation immediately, because he was using ombudsman time and his influence as an ombudsman to get a job. And it ended up not working out for him. He wasn't there very long before he was terminated, but we made a decision that was not obviously an appropriate role for an ombudsman, and he had not handled that well. So that prompted us to contact the Ohio Ethics Commission and ask them whether ombudsmen are subject to the Ohio ethics law. Because they are, even though they're not state employees, they are accountable to our office and part of a state entity as part of the office, as envisioned by the Older Americans Act. And so in 2014, the Ohio Ethics Commission wrote us a letter and said, yes, indeed, ombudsmen are public officials for purposes of the Ohio ethics law. So now we also include training on the Ohio ethics law in our ombudsman training. That's actually their last day of training before they take their certification exam. So we've built that into management. Now we're also required by that law to give the law to new employees within 15 days of employment, and then we'll also be providing it to our volunteer ombudsmen. So some examples of ethical dilemmas that we run into, I'll try to get through a few of these quickly. So we look at, we have in our rule also with regard to conflict of interest in our rules, as an ombudsman handling a complaint, if they run into a situation where they feel that they cannot be objective, then they need to notify us and they get removed from that activity and so on. So we have lots of things in place that have us be compliant with that law. So one of the things in program management that comes up is requests for our records. So you know what the Older Americans Act says about, and the reg says about confidentiality of ombudsman records, that it's the release is the discretion of the state ombudsman, and we can't release identities without consent or a court order. So we work closely with the Ohio Attorney General's Office Medicaid Fraud Control Unit on abuse investigations. We have monthly meetings with them and other agencies to talk about problem facilities and issues that we're dealing with in each of those homes. And in doing so, sometimes the Attorney General's Office wants to place a hidden camera in a nursing home, or they ask us for information. Maybe a consumer, maybe a family member has called them and made a complaint, and they've told them, well, I've worked with the ombudsman. So the Attorney General's Office will ask for a record. Sometimes we make referrals and say, this particular facility, we think you need to spend some time in. And so it creates a dilemma for us, because we really want the Attorney General's Office to find the things that we have found, but if we don't have consent to release the identity of somebody, that creates an issue for us. And so we have this ethical dilemma. The Attorney General's Office completely understands that and works with us and we protect the confidentiality of the consumer as long as we can. And there have been probably 2 occasions when the Attorney General has gone to court and shown up at my office for a court order for release of the name of a resident. So, and it's always when a resident doesn't have capacity is when we have the difficulty, because most people will give us consent, but it's when we have residents who don't have capacity and don't have a surrogate decision maker, that's when we run into the issues. So, so that's one example. One that we work on a lot, and we actually have a case going on right now, is with regard to discharge. You know, that is our top complaint every year. I think that's a high complaint, might even have been our top complaint last year nationally. And so we have the situation where a resident was discharged from a nursing home and became homeless on August 11th. We've been working with our regional ombudsman on that situation, and she has some sort of, we have concerns about whether she's being objective in her approach to the facility, and whether she is really being an advocate for this resident. So we are providing a lot of detailed direction to her, step-by-step direction on investigation of this complaint, because this gentleman has been homeless since August 11th. He has a vehicle, and he is staying at rest stops overnight. So we have a lot of issues related to that I won't go into, but it points out the need for us to always be grounded in who is my client, what does my client want, and you know, who was the bad actor in this situation. So did he do something he shouldn't have done to a nurse? Yes, we think he did. He said that he did, but I don't think making the resident homeless was the appropriate response. And so we're having to be continually reminding. So, you know, in these situations, it's, you know, Sarah's advice has always been to trust your gut. And I think that's really important because we need to, again, be grounded. I can't say that enough. We have, you know, in this situation with the resident, he doesn't want to go back to that facility. So, but we're not his social worker, so it's not our responsibility necessarily to find him a place to live, but our focus is on what did the nursing home do and what didn't the nursing home do. The health department went in and did not substantiate our complaint, which is another concern. So we told the ombudsman, I need a solid investigation so I can make a new complaint to the health department, because that facility needs to be cited. It's very clear to us that they violated regulations. So we clearly need to give them more information. So we have to really talk about what is our role in these situations. We're not the social workers, we're not APS. And this resident tells me, you know, he texted me like all weekend. That first weekend he was out of the nursing home, he said, I haven't been out in the world for 2 years. I saw the sunrise this morning, and who knew you could actually get a hot breakfast? He had gotten his breakfast from McDonald's. So he's not like destitute. He has some money. He has some need for medical care, but level of care was questionable, and he was working on finding an apartment and getting out of the facility. So, you know, it is a fine line for us in how we operate. And then one other, which is in the article that, in the chapter that Carol sent, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's in closures, facility closures. You know, we have facilities that are really bad actors, and like the one that is almost closed has one resident left in it. I've been dealing with for 30 years as an ombudsman. When I was the local ombudsman, it was a problem. And so did I want it to close? Absolutely, I did. Are there some residents who didn't want to move? Absolutely, there were residents who didn't want to move. But they were residents who weren't heavily dependent on the care of the facility and sort of fended for themselves as residents of the nursing home. And so that's why they didn't feel the need to move. But there were other residents who were much more affected by poor care and services. So those are just a few examples. We'll have some time for discussion. I don't want to take more time before we get into scenarios, and we'll just keep chiming in and talking.
Great, Bev.
Yeah. So thanks a lot. One of the things that we want to do next is to look at the 3 scenarios that you received by email from Carol. And we had some questions posed, so we will have just a little bit under 10 minutes per scenario for questions and discussion. And this really is your time to let us hear your ideas about how you would work through this, what advice you give program representatives, and just kind of respond to the questions that we presented for the scenarios. Carol will read the scenarios, then we'll facilitate the discussion. Following these 3 scenarios, we will have time for questions and discussion. So you can pose questions to each other, to us. You can share what you've done, your good practices. So we really, that's why we're kind of breezing through the scenarios in order to have some time where you can raise your issues and share what you know and your good tips with each other. So Carol, if you would read the first scenario, please.
Sure. An Ombudsman Program representative contacts you for consultation regarding a resident named Mr. Bergenen. I'm going to ask him how he pronounces his name. He lives in Baywater Nursing Home, has a mental health diagnosis, and has become aggressive recently, verbally threatening other residents and staff, pushing others, and throwing objects at anyone who enters his room. His daughter called the Ombudsman representative to intervene and asked them to intervene. She said other residents and some staff are demanding that Mr. Bergenen be removed from the facility, claiming they fear her dad. The Ombudsman representative is seeking guidance on how to proceed before making a visit to the home. And the question.
Thanks, Carol.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and if you were in South Louisiana, you would know that would be Mr. Bergeron. So.
Oh.
So the questions that we posed, and we're not going to take these necessarily one by one, but what are the ethical and values considerations? Because sometimes when you pose that question, when people are in an ambiguous situation, then they begin to list them, not only from Mr. Bergeron, but also from the daughter and what potentially could be the facility's ethical and value considerations. Whose interest is the Ombudsman representative supposed to pursue? And how would you advise them to proceed? And how then could you use this kind of situation as a training opportunity for your program? So if 1 or 2 people would just kind of give us some highlights of how you would address these questions. And if you want to speak, just indicate in chat or raise your hand, and Katie can unmute you. Or you can type in a message and your response in the chat. But this really is not for Bev, Carol, Amity, Katie, and me to give you the answers. It's what do you think and what would you do?
Well, this is Sean. I guess in the first question, what are the ethical values and considerations? I guess what I thought about was in this situation, I don't even know if Mr. Bergeron, for example, is requesting my assistance. I guess I'd also want to know, I would have to get consent from Mr. Bergeron. So again, I guess I'm getting, then at the same time, it may be that I have some conflict because it may be true that Mr. Bergeron is doing these things. So then I may start to think about other residents and whether or not there's any truth to the fact that, that the fact that Mr. Bergeron's there, is he actually threaten the health and well-being of other residents. So I guess those are some of the considerations that came across my mind when I saw this.
Thanks, Sean. And those certainly are just on point. Any other thoughts about how you would respond to these questions?
This is Joe. I guess I'd ask myself, what is prompting Mr. Bergeron to become aggressive? What's the root cause of the problem here? Is it a manifestation of his mental health diagnosis, or is there something else going on that's agitating the resident?
Great. And that's important to find out. Certainly something an ombudsman want to ask.
This is Melanie. Just to build on what Joe was saying, I would also ask of the daughter, since she's the one that has called, what has the facility done already? You know, have they had care planning meetings? Have they advised her about different strategies they've tried already? You know, just to get a little bit more information from her since she's on the phone. So, you know, some of the things that have taken place already or not taken place already.
Right, and you certainly would want to know those. So what would you do if you determine that the facility has done some things, perhaps there's more that they could do, but that the actions that are alleged in the scenario, many of those have indeed occurred. Mr. Bergeron is seen by some residents as threatening, and some of the staff are really afraid of him. And at the same time, Mr. Bergeron, yes, he wants you to help him because he's not getting what he needs there. So whose interest does the Ombudsman representative represent?
Well, I guess it's Sean, if Mr. Bergeron has asked for assistance from the Ombudsman and given consent, then the Ombudsman represents Mr. Bergeron's interests.
Yes, obviously the Ombudsman would represent his interest. So what do you do about the other residents who are fearful of him?
I guess in that situation, then that would be, I'm just expecting. So I guess as an ombudsman, if I was in that situation, I would, I guess I would also hear the other residents' complaints or comments. So then, in feelings about Mr. Bergeron, and I guess that would be, in my mind, the ombudsman would have to separate Mr. Bergeron from those other complaints, and I guess proceed in a way in which, with the facility, whereby I guess again, I guess it would be important, as one of the persons spoke about, what has the facility done and what do they plan to do. So I guess I would, the specific question, Mr. Bergeron's interest, but I would also have to take in consideration, if I'm the ombudsman for that facility, that there may be other residents who feel differently, and that those would have to also be considered. And I don't know whether or not you, in that situation, whether or not you bring in other ombudsmen, so that if there's a conflict that's too big to overcome, that maybe the other ombudsman could represent or speak for the other residents that have issues with Mr. Bergeron, or issues about in this situation.
Thanks, and that is something that certainly could be considered, because as an ombudsman, the responsibility is to represent the positions and to work on behalf of residents, not take one resident's position over and against what everybody else wants if they're in if you have a situation where the facility's in an uproar, and sometimes facilities have kind of done the divide and conquer and use opinions of other residents that maybe the facility kind of helps take hold as a reason to issue an involuntary transfer and discharge notice. So the key is, how do you help Mr. Bergeron have his needs met, as well as help other residents feel secure in their environment and in their home as well. So it's the responsibility of the facility to work things out on behalf of all residents, not say, well, we like these other residents, easier to care for than Mr. Bergeron, so that's it, he's out of here. But the questions that you all started with initially in terms of what does Mr. Bergeron want, does he want the Ombudsman to intervene and try to get to the bottom of it, and what has the facility done, what's prompting the behavior? There are a lot of good questions to be asked to learn more information. It goes back to good actions begin with good facts. So you need to know a lot more than you do in this little scenario about how to move forward. But we threw this in as an example of sometimes ombudsmen are asked or made to feel maybe, or others try to make ombudsmen feel like they need to choose one resident's perspective over others, or a number of residents' perspectives over the one resident. And you're not an ombudsman. Residents don't have dibs on you, so that the first person who calls you gets what they want and you represent them, to the neglect of the perspective of other residents in the facility when they're in a community setting. Okay, let's move on to the second scenario. And Carol, if you'd read this, then we will go into some discussion.
Okay. During a routine review of documentation, you see that one experienced Ombudsman Program representative has a high number of individual consultations and very few complaints in a facility with chronic problems that now has a ban on admissions. You call the Ombudsman representative and learn that when residents and families ask if they need to consider moving to another facility, she suggests to them that they should stay put. She says that the other options would be a distance from the current community and too disruptive. Almost everyone who has sought her advice has decided to remain in the current facility. She is glad that she can help them.
Thanks. So, what are the ethical considerations in this situation? And then what would you say to the Ombudsman representative? What guidance or policies and training might be helpful to Ombudsmen who may encounter something like this? And how would you follow up with this Ombudsman representative? She feels that she's done a really good job, and obviously she is giving advice to residents who ask. So do you see any ethical considerations, first of all?
This is Joe. I guess I'd ask, are there any biases toward the facility that this representative has? You know, why is she so insistent that residents stay put? And how is this going to be disruptive to residents? Is there something else that's going on here?
Those are really good questions to ask.
So this is Sean. I guess just building on what Joe said. I think some of the considerations, it does seem just, and I guess in thinking about this, I was reading the Code of Ethics of the Ombudsman. So I guess that would be something, maybe it talks about guidance and policies and change would be helpful. So in talking with the OR about this, it does seem as though that the OR could be substituting, her beliefs or judgments for that of the resident. And then it's also a question about whether or not she's respecting or promoting a resident's right to self-determination, in the sense of she's kind of giving the residents her opinion and saying that you kind of implying that you should choose this. And then also the ombudsman has a role of determining what the actual residents' wishes are. So it seems as though the ombudsman, you could have a discussion with the OR in regards to the code of ethics, and just in this scenario, and ask whether or not, that's if the ombudsman believes that as though she's or he's doing that in the situation, that can maybe start a dialogue where you can maybe look at these things with fresher eyes.
Good tips.
And
Any
this is
other
Carol.
thoughts?
I guess I'm back to the whole reason that this came up was in looking at the number of consultations versus the number of complaints. And I'm wondering if the ombudsman representative is skipping over whatever they're complaining about and getting, going to kind of this, are you going to stay or go, as opposed to, why are you asking that question? What issues are you having? Because if the survey agency is getting a lot of complaints or finding a lot of deficiencies, one would think that in visiting room to room, resident to resident, that the ombudsman would also be hearing things. So the fact that there are very few complaints says to me that maybe this representative needs to kind of have a back to basics training on how to have a conversation to get to what it is that's really bothering somebody.
Good points. Anybody else?
And along with that, this is Joe, and along with that, not to project your own opinions and values onto what the resident should or shouldn't do.
Thank you. And to me, that ties in with one of those other teaching points around exerting undue influence. Sometimes ombudsmen really like to be asked their opinions because they're happy to give people their opinions. And especially in a case where, because who knows better than ombudsman rules, regulations, what's going on in different facilities, community resources, options, which generally is true. I mean, I don't mean to make light of that at all. Ombudsmen typically are the go-to resource and know a lot more about many of those things than anybody else, even the paid staff. However, I think the flip side of that is sometimes it's easy to be a little bit flattered because somebody wants your personal opinion and, well, what should I do? And to just default into giving them your answer based on your own values without asking questions and helping them consider alternatives, options, decide what their value structure is, what they need, and helping them make their own decision versus just telling them what you think they ought to do and how they should live their life, which pretty much is not the ombudsman role ever. And I wanted to go back real quickly before we move to the next scenario and pick up on something Sean said about going back and looking at the Code of Ethics. If I were conducting a real training on this in person for longer than 30 minutes in 3 scenarios, I would have people pull out the Code of Ethics, and it's hard to get people sometimes to identify ethical considerations. It's easier for them to talk about what ombudsman process would do, how they would do an investigation. But if you have them identify specific numbers or some of the list in the Code of Ethics, the principles in the Code of Ethics that apply to this situation, and talk about why and how they would work with that, or how they would derive some guidance for that in a given situation, it sometimes serves not only as a teaching device, it opens up lots of wonderful, rich dialogue in a training session but it also helps people connect the dots from a theoretical code of ethics, oh, client's right to self-determination, that's great, to specific kind of boots on the ground, oh, that's how you apply this here. And I just slipped right past all that self-determination because they wanted my opinion and I gave it to them. And Carol, your piece around is the Ombudsman really doing a thorough enough investigation, listening appropriately, and following up on questions and complaints is a really good one. Okay, I want to move to the third.
This is Beth. Can I make one little comment about that? I had talked about closures, and we seem to be having a lot of those lately. And like I said, sometimes we're pretty happy about them because there are chronic problems. And in this scenario, because there's a regulatory intervention, one of the things that we struggle with sometimes is our Department of Medicaid will say, well, just go ahead and talk to the residents, or they'll tell their contracted managed care plans, just go ahead and talk to the residents and start moving them. And we say, well, I'm not comfortable doing that until I have a letter that says this is the regulatory enforcement action that the health department is taking and that CMS is taking. I don't want it to look like we're doing it. So providing those residents who are asking, should I go, saying, well, I can give you some factual information about the compliance history of this facility. And here, by the way, is a letter from the government saying that they can't take new residents due to problems. So we give them factual information from independent sources.
Those are really good points, Bev. Thank you. Yes.
This is Melanie. When we have residents that ask about changing, I usually tell our Ombudsman representatives to refer them to the Aging and Disability Resource Connection to talk about options, because this might be an opportunity for someone to move back home or move to a different location. And we're not the best, I don't think, at making that assessment. So when I get an Ombudsman representative who says, oh, I'm trying to help a family find a different nursing home, I would say to them, no, you shouldn't be doing that. The options counselor should be doing that stuff. So maybe it's just my approach, but certainly in this scenario, if residents are asking, should I consider it? We could say, what are your reasons for considering? Maybe you do or maybe you don't, but once they're actually asking about whether to make a move or not, I think that's something that should be referred.
That's a good point, Melanie, and it also underscores the whole other element around what's the appropriate role of the Ombudsman. And it's usually connecting individuals to key resources to provide the assistance and help they need, versus doing everybody else's job for them. But the points that you made are good. So thanks. Okay, let's move to the third scenario. And Carol, if you would please read this one.
Sure. You have been asked to join a new statewide elder abuse coalition. You know that Ombudsman Program representatives encounter numerous systemic issues related to abuse. You expect your participation will create more awareness of abuse in facilities, help coordinate efforts with other statewide entities, and clarify the role of the Ombudsman Program. One of the coalition's goals is to improve interagency coordination through case review. The other members will expect you to share cases in order to identify individual and systems issues related to abuse.
Thank you. So obviously, what are the ethical considerations regarding your participation? What information can you share without resident consent and without their consent to reveal their identity? Do you have any safeguards around what you would share? And then how do you explain your role and the responsibilities of Ombudsman representatives to coalition members who maybe don't really get it with Ombudsman policies and procedures and confidentiality and working with consent? And then does your participation follow the same policies and guidelines that apply to Ombudsman representative work and disclosure of program information? So who wants to share how you would think through the appropriateness of your participation in this kind of coalition, how you would explain your role, and what you would kind of go through in terms of what you can share. I mean, obviously, if you have a resident's consent to share their information with the coalition, that's a no-brainer. That's easy. But a lot of times you probably don't for some of the scenarios where you would like to really have the coalition be aware of what kinds of things exist. So type something in chat, raise your hand, let Katie know to unmute your line. We know that there are many more people on the line who have not voiced an idea. So please share some thoughts with us.
The nice thing about ethical issues is that it's gray area, and so there's often not a clear right or wrong answer. So feel free to just start a conversation.
I guess I would go to, this is Sean. So when I was thinking about this, I think I could participate, but I would have to make clear that my participation, I would have to follow the policy and guidelines that apply to, the Ombudsman program. So in regards to the expectation that I would freely provide information that could identify individuals that came through the Ombudsman program, I would make clear that that's not something that I could do without the consent, and I have strict rules that I have to follow. And if that meant that if they couldn't accept that, then that would mean I wouldn't want to participate. I mean, I couldn't participate with the group. I mean, I would want to, given the overall goal, but I would have to make clear that that's what I would have to, that's, I guess, my standard to be able to participate.
Thanks for sharing. Somebody else?
Sean's obviously right. We can't disclose resident identity or identifying information without appropriate consent. So that's going to limit our participation in these elder abuse coalitions. We could certainly talk about, situations without revealing identities or locations of residents. But we just need to be careful not to reveal any identifying information.
This is Melanie.
Thank you, Joe. Go ahead.
It's probably easier in some of our bigger states than it might in, like, Sean's state, for example. But we have a lot of personal care homes and a lot of nursing homes. So unless it's a really a very specific scenario you're sharing, we can say lots of general things in these coalitions about what might work or what wouldn't work or what are barriers or some of those other things. In states with fewer residents, sharing even general stuff might kind of identify people. I don't know. But here in Georgia anyway, again, unless it's something really unique, we can participate fairly easily because, I mean, those bad people do the bad stuff all over the state. So we can offer helpful information, I think, without revealing identities fairly easily.
Good points. And I was thinking that maybe one thing that might be helpful in terms of trying to decide what your role is and whether or not you can share information, would be to develop kind of a list of little criterion that would be kind of a litmus test before you share a scenario that you know you want to share in one of these meetings, and running down it to see if there's anything in it that's so unique to the person, the facility, the place that people could pinpoint it if you don't have permission, or if trying to anticipate the kinds of questions that then the other members of the coalition would start asking, or if they ask you to suggest solutions or what could turn it around, how you might respond to that, and is there anything in your responses to either of those scenarios that would then inadvertently reveal identity. So it may be just running what you would like to share by somebody else to see before you go, another person in the Ombudsman program, to see if they could connect the dots and figure out, oh, well, that's got to be X county, or that has to be, over in this other place. And maybe there is, or maybe there isn't. And if there is, then maybe it's going back to what are the key principles you can distill and bring those to the group as issues that have occurred that need to be addressed. And I think it's sometimes in conjunction with these kinds of questions and opportunities to join with others to really maybe come up with systems change that's so important to individuals whom you serve. It may be a little tempting to share a little bit too much just because these people want to help and they have positions of power where they can make a difference. And it's a temptation to try to justify things by being a little bit expedient and helping lots of residents, and maybe they will never exactly pinpoint it to the identity of a specific person, or maybe you've overshared a little bit, but it's trying to make sure that you're consistent and you have consistent guidelines and keep the confidentiality of the resident. Because it's hard for you to enforce program policies and procedures and hold ombudsman representatives accountable when maybe you aren't always following them to the letter yourself. Okay, Carol, I'm going to turn it over to you for any questions and answers or discussions. If people want to share something, ask questions, and then to focusing on the resources and wrapping it up.
Great, thank you. So we've got about 10 minutes or so. If anyone has a question raised by the presentations that Sarah or Bev did, or any of the case scenarios that we've just done. So there are several of you that haven't spoken yet. And I encourage you to say something, either just hello or ask a question, or those of you who have spoken, feel free to jump in. This is just kind of an open time. And mentors, if you have any tips that you want to share, ways that you've kind of reminded yourself what the ethical code is, ethics code is, or how you have trained in your state, feel free to share those tips. Katie, I don't suppose we have anybody typing anything in? Or...
I'm sorry, it's Joe. I was blabbing, but I had muted myself. I had a question. Here in California, we take the Ombudsman Code of Ethics and have developed a form that we ask Ombudsman candidates to review as they're preparing for certification or designation as representatives of the office. And we ask them to agree to abide by the Code of Ethics. We ask them to sign a form saying that they will, and then on an annual basis, when we review for conflicts of interest, we also go over the Code of Ethics again. And I was wondering if anybody else has incorporated that as a part of their certification and renewal of certification process.
Unmute yourself if you're talking, because we're not hearing you.
This is Sean. We don't do that, but I think that's a good idea. So we might make a change.
Okay. We just started doing the annual renewal because of the regs, and thought it was a good idea just to go over these things once again.
Yeah, we want to do for the conflict of interest, but I think it's a good thing to add on about the Code of Ethics. So I think it's a good add-on.
Yeah.
What's the method that you use, Joe?
It's done in a group setting, and then if there are issues that come up, we ask representatives or potential representatives to self-identify what the issue is and to discuss it privately with the coordinator.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great tip. Thanks, Joe.
Sure.
Any other questions or thoughts or tips?
I would say that in terms of using the code, this Sarah, Code of Ethics with training, some other things that I've done that typically spark a surprising amount of discussion is using the Code of Ethics and having, and you could even do this as an in-service, having people look at it and either take turns each reading one or something like that. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to do that, and talk about what's one challenge for them in upholding that piece, or creating a scenario where that one applies, or asking which of those 12 principles, which two are the most difficult, and then find out why it's difficult for someone, what else they would like, what else maybe you could provide or other individuals in the program could provide as just reassurance or assurance, or think through some of these scenarios. And it also usually provides a lot of insight into how different ombudsman representatives are really working with Code of Ethics or approaching the tough situations, or if they even have a clue about some of the things that really get to the heart of what those different elements mean, and especially mean in terms of implementation. Or you can flip it around and ask them as they read each one, what's a question they've come across in their complaint work, or responding to requests for information and consultation that have made them wonder what's the right thing to do with implementing one of those provisions of the Code of Ethics. So it doesn't have to be a real involved training to be able to give people some good guidance and find out at a deeper level how people are really applying the ethical principles and marrying that with the ombudsman approach to complaint processing.
Thanks, Sarah. I think we'll move on to the resources and training materials that are available. And you guys all know that the NORC staff and any other ombudsman across the country are always interested and available if you have a question or a scenario that you want to discuss. So some of the resources that we included in this PowerPoint are on the NORC website under support, and then program management, and then the word ethics. Or you can just search for ethics and on the NORC website, and you will come across some really good references, the reference guide for ombudsman, in-service training ideas, conflict of interest, applying ethical principles, and then the article that Bev and Mike wrote, and then working through ethical dilemmas, and then both the NASOP and NALTCO codes of ethics are all on the website. Again, they would, they're great things to look through for your information, but also to look at it in terms of how can I push this information out to my ombudsman representatives? Is this a in-service that you have in person? Is this something that you ask them to look at? Just like Bev was saying, she hands out the article that she and Mike wrote, and then have questions that people can respond to. So a ton of information on that website. And then, is there a second? Oh, that's it. So that is, again, that's under the support, program management, and then ethics. So at this point, unless anyone has any last questions, I'll give you 5 seconds to jump in, and then I'm going to finish this. Okay. Hey, I want to thank Bev and Amity and Sarah for the information they presented today. I want to thank the experienced ombudsman for their input, and those of you that are new, please know again that we are all here to help support you, and this webinar, like many other webinars that we do, will be on our website within a day or so. Please feel free to reach out to us. Please feel free to print out and look at the ethics law and aging article, the code of ethics and question resources, and the PowerPoint and the scenarios. Please feel free to use them for other training. And with that, we look forward to seeing many of you in Washington for the Consumer Voice Annual Conference. The orientation session will be Sunday, November the 4th. Whatever that Sunday is. I think it is the 4th. 5th. November 5th. Sunday, November 5th in the morning. So you'll need to arrive on Saturday. You'll be getting more information about that in the near future. So thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you in the future. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.